The sleet began as pinpricks against Catherine Ross's face and settled into steady needles by the time she turned into the Covent Garden lane, one hand on the warped handle of a splintered cart and the other pressed under the lip of a crate to keep it from sliding. Dawn had not yet lifted fully. Window glass held a weak grey shine. Fishmongers shouted into the wet as if noise alone could make trade appear. The books in her cart had been wrapped in old sailcloth, but rain found every seam, and the smell of damp paper rose around her like a warning. Her right glove had split at the thumb the previous day. The blister beneath it had opened again. Each jolt of the wheel over uneven stone worked the skin raw and drew a fresh line of blood across the kid leather, then down to the hem of her sleeve. Behind her, Lady Marwood's footman walked in a dry greatcoat and tall boots blacked to mirror shine, carrying nothing, counting each volume in a loud voice meant for strangers. 31 sermons in cuff, 4 Greek grammars, 1 atlas lacking spine. Mark it, Miss Ross. Mark it now. She did not look back. She did not ask him to lower his voice. 2 market boys paused with baskets between them and watched her stumble at the gutter edge, watched him click his tongue as if she were careless with what had once been her father's pride. The boys laughed, not cruelly, merely as boys laugh at what has been made ordinary to them. Catherine tightened her fingers around the cart and moved again before the wheel could sink in the rut. Cold had entered her boots before sunrise and remained there, a shallow lake against her stockings that climbed with each step. Her toes had gone numb first, then begun to ache as feeling returned in stinging waves. The damp climbed her skirts and settled at her knees. Her shoulders burned from days of the same labour, though the work had never belonged to her in this form when her father was alive. In those years she had stood behind a polished counter with clean cuffs and a sharpened pencil, entering titles in a neat hand while he spoke with clergymen, barristers, and teachers who argued over editions as if books were nations. Now she dragged stock through mud, while coachmen glanced down from their boxes and then away, seeing enough to understand a hierarchy and no reason to question it. A woman in rose-coloured wool, sheltered under her husband's umbrella, drew her child a little closer as Catherine passed, not from fear of theft or violence, but from an instinctive refusal to brush against visible disgrace. Hunger made every smell vivid and cruel. Warm yeast from a baker's door 3 streets over. Coffee from a coffee-house where clerks stood in dry collars and read newspapers in comfort. Onion and dripping from a pieman's tray. She had eaten nothing since a heel of bread the previous afternoon. Lady Marwood had sent the tray away untouched at supper and informed the maid that Miss Ross had no appetite for gratitude. Catherine had said nothing then. She said nothing now. Silence cost less strength than protest, and strength was the only coin she possessed before noon. By the time St. Paul's bells marked the half-hour, she had reached the narrow frontage of the stall on Paternoster Row, where Ross volumes were sold on commission to men who still trusted the name, if not the household behind it. The painted sign was flaking. The R had faded nearly white. She set the brake with her heel and lifted the first crate down alone, while the footman stood under the awning and recited numbers as if reading charges at trial. Place them where all may see. Lady Marwood has instructed that no article leave your hands uncounted. A clerk from the stationer next door looked up from his ledger long enough to smirk. 2 apprentices carried a bale past her, slowed, and listened. Catherine knelt on the wet boards and opened the crate. Damp had curled the corners of 2 pamphlets and warped one spine. She pressed the leather gently, feeling that small internal break where old glue gives way. Pain flashed from her thumb to her wrist when she reached for the next volume. She shifted grip and continued. 32, the footman called. 33. Do not conceal the quarto beneath the folios, Miss Ross. It has been listed. The words were chosen for effect. Conceal, listed. Miss Ross, spoken with a servant's courtesy and a gaoler's meaning. A gentleman in a drab travelling cloak paused at the edge of the stall and took up a sermon volume, then glanced at her glove, at the blood darkening the seam, and replaced the book without opening it. Tray did not pause for pity. Pity did not pay printer's fees. She sorted by size first, then subject, then condition, though sleet ran from her hair into her collar and made the paper labels blur. She rewrote them anyway. The ink spread on cheap stock. She waited for each line to set, breathing over her fingers to warm them enough to hold the pen straight. She was called plain often enough to make it a settled fact in other mouths. Too thin, too dark, eyes too large for her face, a mouth built for argument and wasted on apology. She had heard every version while standing 2 steps behind her stepmother at assemblies where she was introduced only when omission would have seemed rude. Yet rain altered edges. It stripped powder from fashionable faces and left hers bare, pale and sharp as carved bone. Her hair, dark and heavy, had escaped its pins beneath the bonnet and clung in wet strands along her throat. There were no jewels to distract from the severity of her features, no silk to soften her outline. What remained was attention itself. She missed nothing. Not the way the stationer's clerk copied her prices and raised his by a halfpenny, because he knew she could not challenge him. Not the way a curate slipped one tract back into place when he saw her watching, and then paid full despite the stain on the cover. Not the way the footman stepped closer whenever she bent, as though labouring women became thieves by posture. She marked every sale in a pocket notebook, whose pages she kept wrapped in waxed cloth under her bodice. Her cataloguing hand remained precise even when her fingers shook. Abbreviations marched down the margin in clean sequence, condition symbols exact, owner marks noted where present. Her father had taught her to read title pages, as men read faces. Imprint, year, printer, binding, provenance. Truth hid in such lines. On winter nights, long ago, with candle smoke caught in the beams and frost silvering the inside of the panes, he had tested her memory with Latin tags until she could sort misplaced quotations by ear. He had laughed when she corrected him once, then kissed the top of her head and called her his best apprentice. That memory had become a private room no one could enter, not Lady Marwood, not debt collectors, not the city itself. Near midday the sleet thinned to rain, heavier and warmer, and the street changed pitch. Wheels hissed over stone, voices lifted, errand girls hurried with baskets under their cloaks. Catherine loaded the unsold stock back into the cart, with movements that had become mechanical: bend, brace, lift, stack, tie. Her shoulders trembled on the final crate. The footman noticed and pretended not to, then announced for the hearing of the nearest passers-by, "Lady Marwood will inspect each item upon your return. Any deficit will be deducted from your board." Board. A narrow attic room with a cracked basin. A blanket thin as paper. Supper when Lady Marwood remembered performance required witnesses. Catherine set the rope knot with numb hands and nodded once. "I have recorded all transactions." "You will submit the record for review." "I always do." He gave her a look that suggested insolence where there had been none, and moved ahead to clear a path she did not need cleared. She pulled the cart into the flow of traffic. The wheel caught at once in a broken seam between stones. The handle struck her hip hard enough to wake the bruise there, yellow gone green beneath her gown, where last week's reprimand had landed in private. She swallowed the sharp breath before it made a sound. On a corner by the apothecary, a girl no older than 14 offered her a glance of quick sympathy, then lowered her head when the footman turned. Even kindness had to travel by stealth in streets ruled by rank and debt. By the time she reached the lane behind the shop, church bells had rung the hour and gone silent. Rainwater ran from the roof in steady streams, dripping through a crack in the awning onto the step she had to climb backward with the first crate balanced against her chest. No one came to assist. The cook had been dismissed in spring. The old porter had died in July. The new maid had learned in 2 days that helping Miss Ross invited punishment, and fear had made her efficient. Catherine carried each load through the back passage alone, boots leaving dark prints on stone, breath rough in her throat, fingers trembling so badly by the last crate that she had to set it down twice on the way. At the threshold of the counting room she paused, not from choice, but because the room smelled of lavender and polished wood, and the sweet hot chocolate Lady Marwood favoured after riding, and her empty stomach clenched hard enough to bend her forward. She straightened before the door opened. Silk rustled in the corridor. She knew that sound as other women knew lullabies. Lady Marwood did not appear yet. She rarely spent herself on first arrivals. Commands came through others. Punishments came later, when the house had gone quiet and there were no witnesses to trouble the story. Catherine wiped rain from her face with the back of her torn glove, set the ledger on the table, and began to enter the day's numbers in her careful hand, while water still ran from her hem and pooled beneath her chair. Outside, wheels rolled toward brighter streets. Inside, she wrote each title cleanly, each loss precisely, each coin accounted for, because the name Ross remained the last inheritance she could defend with ink. The ink had not yet dried on the day's final entry when the door opened and Lady Marwood came in with rain pearls still clinging to the hem of her dove-grey silk, the scent of lavender moving ahead of her as steadily as accusation. She did not look at the puddle beneath Catherine's chair. She looked only at the ledger, then at Catherine's hand, then at the cracked glove, as if injury itself were an offence against household order. "Stand," she said. Catherine rose at once, knees stiff from lifting crates, and slid the book across the table with both hands so the damp would not touch the fresh columns. Lady Marwood did not sit. She remained standing, gloved fingertips at the page edge, reading each line aloud in a measured voice that turned numbers into trespass. 2 tracts sold below mark, 1 spine warped in transit, 1 devotional text stained. Explain. Catherine kept her gaze on the grain of the tabletop because meeting Lady Marwood's eyes invited charges of insolence, while lowering her head too far invited charges of sulking, and there was no safe posture except stillness. The tract stock was foxed before dispatch. I wrote it in the Morning Register. The devotional was damp when unwrapped at the stall. I marked it unsound before sale. Lady Marwood turned 1 page backward, then another. Searching less for error than for permission to punish, she found a comma she disliked and tapped it once. Your father trained your hand too well. It gives you ambitions above service. The words landed cleanly because she had honed them for years. Service, gratitude, debt. She had entered the Ross household when black crape still covered the mirror in the front parlour from Catherine's mother's burial, arriving with trunks of French gowns and a smile that made neighbours praise her practical devotion to a widower in trade. Within 3 months, she had dismissed the porter who questioned account changes, replaced the key ring, and begun saying our stock when she meant her authority. Catherine had been 17 then, old enough to understand that grief could be used as leverage, and young enough to believe a fair objection might alter anything. It had not. By winter her father's cough had deepened into fever, By Candlemas, his signature appeared on paper he had no strength left to review, and by the time frost lifted from the window panes, he had signed away rights to future inventory under terms he would once have called predatory in any customer. He died in a narrow bed above the shop, with one hand still ink-stained and the other clutching the sleeve of the nightshirt Catherine had washed that morning. Lady Marwood wept in the church aisle where all could see, and returned home to ask for the till keys before the candles had burned low. Since then the household had learned a rhythm built on subtraction. Breakfast tray removed untouched because Miss Ross had answered too slowly. Fire in the attic laid only on Sundays. Wages entered in a book and never paid, then counted as offset against board. Orders issued through servants so cruelty wore gloves. Bruises placed where sleeves could hide them. Courtesy demanded in public. Correction delivered in private. Lady Marwood closed the ledger and held out her hand. The pocket record. Catherine took the waxed notebook from inside her bodice and surrendered it. Lady Marwood weighed it once, as though judging coin. "You will copy this in full for Mr. Pike before supper. If your figures differ from his, yours will be deemed false." Catherine felt fatigue move through her like cold water, and forced her voice to remain level. "As you wish." Lady Marwood gave a short nod and turned to the maid waiting at the threshold. "No tray for Miss Ross until she has finished. She is apt to mistake appetite for entitlement." Silk rustled, the door closed. Catherine sat again, fingers numb, and sharpened her pencil with a blade worn thin at the edge, because hunger did not alter arithmetic, and exhaustion did not excuse an imprecise line. The corridor outside filled, then emptied, then filled again with the soft, bright noise of women dressing for callers, while Catherine copied figures by candle that smoked from poor tallow and coated the room in a bitter tang. Her stepsisters, Helena and Ivy Marwood, passed twice before dusk with skirts lifted clear of damp stone, laughing at some remark carried from a neighbouring drawing-room, each wearing a ribbon Catherine recognised from the cedar chest that had once held her mother's things. The first time Helena paused long enough to lean into the doorway and smile with thin curiosity. "Mother says you are to mend my blue pelisse after accounts. The sleeve tore on the carriage latch. Do not prick your blood into the lining this time." Ivy stood behind her, cheeks bright with cold and triumph, one gloved hand resting against the frame as if even wood might be sullied by Catherine's work-table. "Also my dance slippers. The cobbler cannot be trusted with satin." They withdrew before answer was possible. That, too, had become custom. Commands as passing weather, never requiring acknowledgement, never risking refusal. Catherine bent over the pages and copied every entry from memory first, then checked against the pocketbook, because Mr. Pike's numbers often changed between draft and fair copy, and every discrepancy was then hung around her neck like theft. Through the open transom she heard china carried to the small salon, teaspoons against porcelain, the warm clink of comfort served upstairs while her stomach folded into itself below. Once, years ago, the same room had held her father's readers on winter evenings, curates with wet cuffs, a magistrate's clerk with spectacles forever sliding down his nose, two schoolmasters who argued over translation and left with ink on their fingers and laughter in their throats. Catherine had poured tea then from a pot with a cracked spout, while her father introduced her as Miss Ross, my daughter, keeper of the best index in London. She had worn a serviceable wool dress, mended but clean, and no one had spoken her name as if it were debt. Now Helena wore her mother's cameo at assemblies, and Ivy had taken the ivory fan painted with swans and claimed it had always been hers, while the portrait that once stood above the shop mantel was moved to Lady Marwood's private sitting room, and turned inward when guests came, as if the dead might challenge title if allowed to look on. Catherine had asked for the portrait one time only, in a voice she had rehearsed to steadiness. Lady Marwood had answered without raising her own. When your obligations are cleared, you may petition for sentimental objects. Obligations! The list enlarged whenever payment approached. New charges for lamp oil. New charges for mending thread. A charge for broken crockery she had not touched. Interest on old advances never specified in amount. By law, by custom, by the easy indifference of men who preferred finished ledgers to household quarrels, the entries stood unless challenged before a magistrate with documents she did not possess. So she learned to make her own archive in fragments, dates on scrap ends, initials beside odd withdrawals, parcel counts against delivery notes, each sliver hidden where floorboards lifted under the attic trunk. The city called this obedience, and perhaps from the street it looked that way, a plain young woman bowing under boxes, answering yes, my lady, no, my lady, until her voice thinned into habit. But obedience and endurance were not the same craft. Endurance measured time and stored proof. Endurance kept memory sharp where comfort would have blurred it. A little before full dark, Mr. Pike arrived, smelling of wet wool and stale gin, and took the copied book with theatrical gravity. He licked his thumb to turn a page, smudging the margin. "You have rounded this total." "No," Catherine said quietly. "You transposed the shilling column in the draft. I corrected to the receipt." He glanced toward the door as if Lady Marwood might materialise from panelled wood, then lowered his voice. "You would do well to be less exact, Miss Ross. Exact women are disliked." She met his eyes then, not with defiance, only with a steadiness that had cost her dearly to acquire. "In this house, inexact women are ruined faster." He gave a small sound that was not quite laughter, and signed the bottom line, leaving his blot heavy, where her hand would have left only a clean initial. When he had gone, Catherine carried the ledger and copied book upstairs for inspection, and waited in the anteroom outside Lady Marwood's dressing chamber, while a maid pinned fresh lace at the mistress's cuff, and Helena rehearsed a smile in the mirror. Candlelight burnished gilt frames. Coal heat breathed from the grate. The contrast made her wet hem feel colder. Lady Marwood read the signature page, drew a line beneath the total with deliberate slowness, and set both books aside. "You will sleep in the small attic tonight. Ivy requires your room for her trunks. See that the chimney there is swept before she returns to town in spring." Catherine inclined her head. "Yes, Lady Marwood." "And the black bombazine in the cedar press is to be altered for Helena's morning visit next week. She has no patience for your mother's old-fashioned seams." The sentence struck with the precision of a knife laid flat. Catherine kept her face still, though the words dragged memory forward so hard she could taste smoke from another winter entirely. Her mother at the cutting table, chalk dust on her sleeve, humming under her breath while Catherine held pins between her lips. Her father at the doorway with a parcel of newly bound sermons, pretending sternness when he found both women laughing at his Latin pronunciation. That room no longer existed except in her mind. The cutting table had been sold. The song had no place left in the house. Only the seams remained, and even those were being unpicked one by one for girls who wore inheritance as ornament. Lady Marwood noticed the pause and mistook it for reluctance. "Do not look injured, Miss Ross. You have been sustained beyond your prospects. Most girls in your station would be grateful for shelter," Catherine answered, as she had trained herself to answer, with careful neutrality that revealed nothing and conceded nothing. "I am grateful for work." Lady Marwood's mouth thinned, perhaps because gratitude without submission sounded too much like dignity. Work, then. Before dawn I require the quarter chest inventoried. Mr. Pike reports irregularity in old folios. I will complete it. You will complete it correctly. Catherine took up the books and backed from the room without turning, as propriety required. In the corridor the candles guttered in a draught from the stairwell, and the house settled around her with creaks she could name from long habit. Loose board near the landing, cracked pane in the west passage, hinge in the schoolroom door that always caught before latching. She climbed to the attic with both ledgers hugged against her chest, entered the smaller room that smelled of soot and mouse dust, and set the books on the trunk that held the last of her own things. 3 dresses worn thin at cuff and hem, 2 grammar texts her father had inscribed, and a folded scrap of paper bearing the Ross Bookseller's seal in red wax, gone dull with years. She lit the stub of candle she had saved, opened the quarter chest list, and began another inventory, while rain tapped against the slanted roof and the household below settled into comfort built from her silence. Each line she wrote a quiet refusal to let their version become the only record. The candle guttered twice and then steadied, thin flame bent sideways by the draught that slipped through the cracked pane above Catherine's trunk, and she kept writing as soot settled over her cuffs, her figures narrowing with fatigue but never losing shape. The quarter chest list ran to 6 pages, her pencil blunted. She cut it sharp again with the little blade and breathed through the hollow ache beneath her ribs until the hunger passed from pain to numbness. Near dawn, the rain thinned to a hard mist that tapped the slanted roof in a dry, patient rhythm. She closed the inventory, wrapped both ledgers in cloth, and carried them down the back stairs while the house still slept in warm rooms. No fire had been laid in the lower grate. The stone flags held night cold. By the time the kitchen clock struck 8, she had already loaded another run of stock for Paternoster Row, and reached the stall with water seeping through her boot seams, and the reopened blister at her thumb sticking to the torn lining of her glove. Trade moved briskly under low cloud. Clerks ducked in and out of stationers' doors with invoices tucked under their arms. A printer's boy swore at a broken strap and dragged paper reams past her counter. Catherine set out sermons, dictionaries, and school texts by price and condition, while Lady Marwood's footman stood at her shoulder reciting counts in that carrying courtroom tone he favoured. At noon, when St. Paul's bells rolled over the roofs and a weak shaft of light struck the wet boards before vanishing again, a household runner in Marwood colours pushed through the crowd and placed a sealed packet on her ledger without greeting. The wax bore Lady Marwood's crest impression over a reused fold. Catherine broke it with hands gone cold for reasons not wholly weather. The order was brief, in Pike's clerkly hand and Lady Marwood's signature beneath. She was to vacate the Ross stall by sunset, surrender the locked folio chest for private transfer, and present herself tonight at a cousin's house in Bloomsbury as unpaid companion for an indefinite term. Refusal would trigger immediate petition under debt law and public seizure of all remaining stock. The words did not rise from the page at once. They settled into her like iron. The stall was not merely trade space. It was the last visible place where the name Ross still stood in paint above goods honestly priced. She read the order twice, then once more, tracing with her eyes the line that demanded the folio chest keys she did not possess because Lady Marwood had kept them on her own chain. The footman leaned in, satisfied already. "You heard her ladyship's will. Begin packing. We depart within the hour." Catherine folded the letter once, very neatly, and slid it inside the waxed pocket-book at her bodice. "I will finish the noon accounts first." "There will be no further accounts?" there will be if you expect to defend a seizure before witnesses." His mouth hardened. He reached for the ledger. She placed her bleeding thumb over the margin and did not move. The street broke open in sound before either could speak again. Iron rims struck loose cobble with a crack sharp as a gun report. A horse screamed and reared half sideways into the lane, harness chains flinging rainwater in arcs. Men shouted. Someone dropped a crate of pamphlets that burst across stone like dark birds. Catherine turned in time to see the carriage lurch, one wheel jolting high where the stone had lifted, and a small figure in dark wool pitched from the step and struck the pavement hard enough that the back of his head made a dull, intimate thud she felt in her own teeth. He did not cry at once. Then breath returned in a thin, choking sound. Blood ran bright at his temple and threaded through rainwater toward the gutter. Catherine was off the stallboards before fear could sort rank from urgency. She dropped to her knees in mud, pulled the boy onto his side and swept 2 fingers through his mouth to clear the blood pooling there while the carriage groom fought the horse and the street closed in with that hungry half-circle crowds make around sudden injury. "Hold his shoulders!" she snapped to the nearest footman, not Lady Marwood's man, but one in sober black livery with silver braid. "Not his throat! If you pin his throat, he will drown in it!" The man froze, glanced over her shoulder for superior command. Boots hit stone behind her, heavy, controlled and close. A voice, low and edged like winter water, cut through the noise. "Leave him! My surgeon is coming!" Catherine tore a strip from the inner petticoat hem with both hands, linen ripping loud as paper. "Your surgeon is not here!" She pressed cloth to the wound and felt warm blood strike her fingers through rain chill. Lift his chin. Slowly. "You there! Keep the crowd back!" The black-liveried footman obeyed her before he seemed to understand why. When she looked up at last, she had to tilt her head to meet him. Lord Alistair Thorne stood 1 pace away, coat dark with rain, broad shoulders filling the narrow lane, as if stone had decided to walk upright. She knew him at once, as everyone in London knew him, the lord who had declined heiresses with fortunes large enough to buy counties, who left ballrooms before supper and answered society gossip with silence so complete it sounded like contempt. Up close he looked less like gossip and more like consequence. Dark hair damp at the temples, jaw held tight enough for the muscle to jump once, eyes the colour of storm water over deep rock, fixed on the child and then on Catherine's hands, which had begun to tremble with effort but did not lift from the bandage. His first command had failed. He did not repeat it. "Name," he said instead. "Catherine Ross." Relation to this boy? None. She shifted pressure as blood slowed to a steadier seep. He struck the right temple, pupils unequal, yet responsive. He must be kept awake. The boy moaned and tried to roll. Catherine braced him with her forearm. "Stay with me. Look at my face. That is right. Do not close your eyes." Lord Thorne crouched opposite her, one knee in muddy water, indifferent to the ruin of his coat. The movement startled the crowd into quiet. Men accustomed to bowing at 10 paces now stared as their lord lowered himself beside a soaked woman in a frayed cuff. He touched the boy's wrist, counted under his breath, then lifted his gaze to Catherine again. "How do you know head injuries?" "My father sold medical texts to St. Bartholomew's apprentices. I listened when they argued." She did not add that she had also nursed her father through fever until breath failed in his chest. Grief had taught enough anatomy to be useful. Lord Thorne angled his body so the crowd could not press closer. "Hugh," he said to his man without looking away from her, "fetch Dr. Ellery from Fleet Street, ride." The footman ran. The boy's lashes fluttered. Rain washed pink from Catherine's knuckles. She leaned closer, voice low and steady. "Tell me your name." "Ned," he whispered, then swallowed hard. "Uncle!" "I am here," Lord Thorne said, and for one moment the hard line of his mouth changed, not softened, only widened by fear held on a short leash. He placed 2 fingers against the child's shoulder. Stillness returned to his face as quickly as it had gone. Catherine tightened the linen as fresh blood welled and met resistance where the cloth had slipped against wet hair. "I need clean pressure and height," she said. "A folded cloak under his neck, not his skull." Thorne stripped his own greatcoat, folded it once and passed it beneath the boy exactly as directed. Their hands met at the edge of the cloth, skin cold against cold, and Catherine felt a sharp current of awareness run up her wrist that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with proximity. She ignored it. She kept count of breaths instead. The black, liveried coachman returned with a travelling valise and dropped to one knee. "My lord, the medicine chest." Catherine opened it, found lint, spirits, and a narrow roll of clean bandage. "Good," she said, before she remembered herself and lowered her tone. "Thank you." She worked quickly, replacing soaked linen, binding firm and low. Lord Thorne watched every movement. His gaze dropped once to the cuff of her sleeve, where the cloth had ridden back, exposing the yellow-green edge of an older bruise above her wrist. His expression did not change, yet the air around him seemed to draw tighter. "Who did that?" he asked. "To your arm." She kept tying the knot. "My lord, the child first." "Answer me." "I have answered what matters." The words were respectful in form, immovable in substance. His eyes held hers for a beat that felt longer than the bells ringing distant noon. Ned retched weakly. Catherine turned him and cleared his mouth again. "Good boy. Breathe." She looked to Lord Thorne. "He must not be jostled. No carriage jolts. Carry him level." "My house is 2 streets distant." "Then we walk." Thorne rose at once and lifted the child with practised care, one arm under shoulders, one under knees, keeping the head supported as Catherine guided the angle with her palm. The crowd parted, then closed behind them. Lady Marwood's footman appeared at Catherine's side, face flushed with outrage he did not dare direct at a lord. "Miss Ross, you will return at once. Her ladyship's order." Lord Thorne did not turn his head. "Silence!" The single word stopped the man as cleanly as a hand to the chest. Catherine reached for her ledger left open on the stall, then for the sealed letter half tucked beneath it. Rain had blurred one corner of the ink, but the signature remained legible. She folded it into her pocketbook. As she did, a book lay half under the carriage step, soaked through at the lower boards where it had fallen when Ned struck stone. Calf binding, gilt mostly worn. She recognised the spine stamp and froze. It was a first edition of Harrington's essays from the Ross Private Reserve, one she had not listed for open sale because it had vanished from the locked upper chest in March. She lifted it carefully, water streaming from the boards, and opened to the flyleaf. There it was, Ross and Company acquisition mark in her father's compact hand, and beneath it the faint impressed crest of House Thorne. She looked from the page to the lord carrying the child, and understood in one cold flash how Lady Marwood meant to profit. Strip-marked volumes from Ross stock, reroute through private intermediaries, sell back to titled libraries under disputed provenance while burying the trail in false debt entries. She slid the damaged book under her arm and followed. Blackthorn House rose from the rain with severe lines and unlit upper windows, a stone front that seemed built less for welcome than endurance. Servants opened before the knocker struck. Dr. Ellery arrived nearly beside them, breathless from hard riding, and took Ned upstairs while Catherine gave a clipped account at the stair-foot. Full height, impact side, bleeding duration, first vomiting, intervals of response. The physician listened without interruption, then nodded once. "You did right." Lord Thorne stood with one hand on the banister, water dripping from his cuff to the marble. "Attend him first," he said, "then report to me." Ellery vanished up the staircase. Quiet settled abruptly, broken only by rain ticking against tall glass. A maid approached Catherine with uncertainty and a folded cloth. Lord Thorne spoke before she could retreat. "Bring hot water, bread, broth, now." The maid curtsied and hurried away. Catherine, suddenly aware of mud to her knees and blood dried dark under her nails, stepped back toward the hall. "My lord, I must return the stall accounts before dusk." "No," he said it without volume. It landed harder than shouting. "You will sit until your hands stop shaking." She looked at her hands. He was right. The tremor had become fine and constant, as if her bones remembered the thud of Ned's fall, and would not release it. She set the recovered first edition on the side table between them. "This came from your carriage step." He glanced down, and something flared in his eyes when he saw the crest and Ross marks sharing the same page. "Where did you get this?" "From stock removed without lawful entry." Catherine drew out Lady Marwood's order and laid it beside the book. "At noon I received command to surrender our folio chest and vacate Ross' stall by sunset under threat of seizure. This volume vanished from our locked reserve months ago. It appears in your carriage on the day she demands private transfer." Lord Thorne read the letter once. His jaw set so hard the scar at his left temple whitened. "Who controls your ledgers?" "Lady Marwood and her clerk. I keep copies where I can." "Can you prove forgery?" Catherine met his gaze directly for the first time since the lane. "If I can access the estate library purchase books and compare dates, signatures and transfer marks, yes." Rain beat harder against the glass. Somewhere above a child cried out once and was quieted. Lord Thorne did not look away from her. "Then hear me clearly, Miss Ross. You will catalogue Blackthorn Library beginning tonight." He lifted the damaged first edition and held it as if it were evidence in court. "You will be paid, you will be protected, and you will not return to Lady Marwood's house unaccompanied." The command was iron, the offer beneath it was law. Catherine felt fear twist with relief, and refused both to rule her voice. "I accept the work, my lord, on one condition." His brows drew in, not offended, merely alert. "State it." "Ross and Company remains mine in name and operation. I do not surrender the shop." His mouth shifted. The smallest motion, not quite a smile and not mockery. Recognition, perhaps, of a bargain spoken without ornament. "Agreed," he said. "Eat first, then we begin." Catherine did not trust the steadiness of her legs, but she sat when he pointed to the narrow settle by the fire and took the bowl the maid brought with both hands so it would not shake. Broth first, then bread torn into small pieces because her fingers had stiffened in the rain. Steam rose against her face and made her eyes sting. Lord Thorne remained standing near the mantel, wet coat gone, shirt sleeves rolled once, watching the hall doors as servants crossed in quick, silent lines, carrying basins, towels, and fresh coals upstairs. No one spoke above a murmur. The house had the taut quiet of a ship in bad weather. She forced herself to swallow slowly. Hunger urged speed. Experience warned against it. By the third spoonful, warmth began to return to her hands in painful pulses. She set the bowl down, wiped her fingers, and reached for the ledger she had carried under her arm through rain, mud, and marble halls. Lord Thorne noticed the movement. "You will finish that after you can hold a pen." I can hold one now, my lord. You can barely hold the spoon. The rebuke held no contempt. It was a fact placed between them. She lowered her eyes for a breath and nodded once. Then I will eat. By the time the long case clock struck 7, she had taken enough food to stop the room from tilting, and enough hot water to clear the metallic taste of old fear from her mouth. A maid led her to a side chamber, where she scrubbed blood from her nails and changed her torn glove for a plain linen wrap offered from household stores. When she returned to the corridor, Lord Thorn was waiting with the damaged first edition in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. He did not ask if she was ready. He said, "Library." Blackthorn's library occupied 2 connected rooms, high-ceilinged and cold despite twin fires. Shelves ran from floor to cornice in dark oak. Ladders stood on brass rails. Tables were laid with blotting sand, sharpened quills, and stacks of accession books bound in green leather. The order was severe but not careless. Books had been loved here, then neglected by grief, then guarded by habit. Catherine felt it at once. This was not a collection arranged for display. It was a mind preserved in paper and calfskin. She set the damaged Harrington volume on the nearest table and opened the first ledger. The hand in the earliest entries was elegant, spare, and exact. Lady Thorne's she guessed from the date and the initials. Later entries shifted to a steward's round script. Recent pages thinned into gaps, then abrupt purchases at inflated prices from intermediaries whose names she recognised from Pike's private lists. Her pulse sharpened. Lord Thorne watched her read 3 pages without interruption. "Can you trace the chain?" "Yes." She turned to him. "If I compare these against Ross reserve marks and your household invoices, I can map each false transfer." "How long?" "If the records are complete, 3 days. If they are not, longer, but not uncertain." His gaze held hers for a beat. "You will have what you require." A footman appeared in the doorway, pale beneath composure. "My lord, Master Ned is wakeful and asking for Miss Ross." Catherine closed the ledger before Thorne answered. "I will come." He stepped in her path. "You are here to catalogue." "And he struck his head 2 hours ago. Wakefulness can turn quickly." The footman looked between them and then down at the carpet. Thorne's jaw tightened. Command rose to his mouth and stayed there. At last he moved aside. 10 minutes, he said. The nursery corridor lay warmer than the rest of the house, yet fear made the air thin. A nurse stood by the bed with folded cloths and uncertain hands. Ned's cheeks were flushed, lashes wet, breath too fast for sleep. He reached for Catherine when she came near, small fingers catching her wrist with surprising force. "You left," he whispered. "I was below stairs," she said, lowering herself beside him. "I am here now." She touched his brow, then the line of his jaw, then the wrapped bandage. Damp, not soaked, but warmer than before. She asked for a lamp to be brought closer and checked his pupils again, one by one. Responsive. Sluggish, but responsive. Dr. Ellery entered at once, coat still damp from the street, spectacles fogged with heat from the room. He examined the child quickly and gave orders in brisk phrases. Fresh bandage at midnight, water in small intervals, no rough movement, no bright light. He turned to Thorne. "The wound is clean. Fever may rise by evening. Keep him wakeful in turns. Send for me if vomiting recurs or speech wanders." "Will he recover?" "With care, yes." Ellery's carriage had been sent onward before the rain worsened. By the time he stepped back into the front hall, wind had risen into a hard, steady howl that drove water against the windows like thrown gravel. The stablemaster warned that Fleet Street was already flooding at the lower turn. Ellery left with 2 riders and a promise to return before dawn if roads allowed. Catherine went back to the library. She lasted exactly 26 entries before hurried steps struck the corridor, and the same footman appeared again, breathless now, formality gone. "Miss Ross, he is calling out and does not know us." She was moving before he finished. In the nursery, Ned had twisted half free of his coverlet, cheeks burning, hands searching at the bandage in confused anger. The nurse tried to soothe him and only frightened him further. His words came in broken pieces, not sense, only fragments of street noise and falling rain. Catherine caught his wrists gently and held them against the blanket. "Ned, look at me. It is Catherine." His eyes found her for one clear second, then slid away. "Water," she said. "Cool, not cold. Clean cloths. And bring the tincture case Dr. Ellery left." The nurse hesitated. My lord said to care for him. Move." The woman ran. Lord Thorne entered as Catherine was untying the bandage knot. Fresh blood had not returned, but heat had built under the linen. She replaced it with clean wrap and lighter pressure, then sat him up by degrees so his breath could settle. He whimpered once and clutched at her sleeve, then at the edge of the blanket. Thorne stood at the bed foot, face carved from restraint. "What is happening?" "Fever from shock and strain. He needs cooling and measured drops, not panic." "Can he hear you?" "Some of it." Ned muttered a word that might have been uncle, then turned his face toward Catherine's hand as if trying to find shade in bright sun. She looked to Thorne. "I need a runner sent for Dr. Ellery now, even if roads are bad." He gave one sharp nod to the footman at the door. "Ride to Fleet Street. If he cannot come, return with his written instructions." The man was gone in seconds. Catherine measured the tincture exactly as instructed, counting each drop aloud under her breath so her own hand would not hurry. She cooled Ned's wrists and neck with damp cloths, changed them as they warmed, and kept his attention tethered to simple questions when he surfaced. His name, his favourite dog at the stables, the colour of his kite. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he only blinked and clung to her voice. Rain deepened into storm. Window panes rattled. Firelight threw restless shadows across the nursery walls, where painted ships seemed to pitch on dark seas. Catherine began to recite from memory, low and even, a sailor's ballad her father had kept in a chapbook with torn blue boards and salt stains on the edges. It had no nursery sweetness. It had rhythm, oars, wind, stars, return. Her father used to say frightened bodies needed cadence before they could accept reason. Ned's breathing began to follow the meter in small, uneven steps. At 9:30, the messenger returned drenched to the bone, boots caked in black street water. He carried a folded note sealed in haste. Dr. Ellery could not cross the flooded turn near Ludgate until the water dropped. Continue cooling cloths, continue measured tincture. Keep the child half raised, wake every quarter hour for response. Send again at first light. Thorne read the note and passed it to Catherine without comment. Outcome delivered, no comfort offered, no false certainty either. She resumed as if nothing had changed. Hours narrowed to tasks, cloth, water, pulse, breath, response, tincture at interval. Speak his name, ask a question, wait. The nurse drifted in and out, useful when directed, trembling when not. Twice she tried to take Catherine's place. Twice Ned cried out and turned away from her hands. The second time, in tired frustration, the woman muttered that the house had known no peace since rain brought strangers through the door. Catherine did not raise her voice. He was hurt in the street and carried home by his uncle through storm. Speak of what happened, not of omens. The nurse stared at her, then dropped her eyes and returned to wringing cloths in silence. Near midnight, Lord Thorne said, "You will rest." Catherine did not look up from the basin. No, that was not a request. She laid a fresh cloth on Ned's brow and answered in the same formal tone she used for figures and receipts. My lord, if he wakes to a different voice in this state, he thrashes and strain raises heat. If heat rises further, we lose ground. I will rest when his fever breaks. The room went very still. When she finally looked up, Thorn had not moved. His expression gave nothing away except an old habit of obedience from others colliding with a new fact he could not dismiss. He turned to the nurse. Do as Miss Ross instructs. The nurse curtsied so quickly she nearly dropped the basin. By 1 a.m, Ned's speech sharpened in brief windows and blurred again. By 2, his pulse had slowed from frantic to merely fast. At 3, rain eased to a steady fall. Wind dropped. The house exhaled in creaks and settling beams. Catherine had not stood in 6 hours. Her back ached from the angle of the chair. Her wrapped hand burned where old blister met new strain. She ignored both and continued the cadence of the ballad. One verse repeated until even she could not tell whether she sang for the child or for herself. Lord Thorn came and went without sound. Once she sensed him in the doorway and turned, expecting a question. He stood in shadow, hands clasped behind his back, watching Ned's chest rise and fall. She offered him the chair by the fire with a tilt of her chin. He did not take it. He remained where he was, a still shape cut against corridor light, then stepped away when Ned stirred. By 4, the fever began to break in slow degrees. Sweat cooled at the child's hairline. His grip eased from desperate to drowsy. He drank 2 small swallows of water without choking, and muttered a complaint about arithmetic lessons that was so ordinary Catherine nearly laughed from relief. She did not. She only pressed his hand once and told him he had survived worse arithmetic than any tutor could devise. At 5, the sky beyond the nursery glass softened from black to iron grey. Catherine changed the final cloth and checked the bandage one last time. Dry, warm, but not burning. She sat back. The room swayed once and steadied. Ned slept. True sleep now, mouth slack, breath deep and regular. Catherine kept her fingers on his pulse through 20 counts, then 20 more because certainty required repetition. When she was satisfied, she let her hand rest lightly over his and closed her eyes for a single blink that became stillness. She did not mean to sleep. Exhaustion took her in fragments, head angled against the chair back, shoulder turned toward the bed as if ready to rise at the smallest sound, one hand still near the child's wrist, the other curled around the folded copy of Ellery's note, smudged from use. Lord Thorn returned to the doorway and stopped. Morning light drew the room in pale lines. The basin ring on the table, the stack of used cloths, the empty tincture vial set upright beside the lamp, Catherine's worn hem, dark with dried rain at the edge of the hearthrug. He looked at each detail as if reading evidence. 6 hours had passed since she first sat down at the bedside. In all that time she had not asked payment, praise, or permission. She had not performed kindness for witness. She had done what was needed because a child was in pain and no one else in the room could hold fear and method in the same pair of hands. He moved once, very carefully, and took the wool throw from the foot of the nurse's cot. He laid it across Catherine's shoulders, without waking her. Ned shifted, sighed, and settled deeper into sleep. When the housekeeper appeared with dawn tea and saw Miss Ross asleep by the bed, she opened her mouth to speak. Lord Thorn raised one finger, and the command was silent. No one disturbed her. No one disturbed her, and the silence itself woke Catherine an hour later with a start so sharp her hand flew to Ned's wrist before her eyes were fully open. His pulse met her fingers steady and warm, not the frantic hammer of night, not the thin flutter that had made each minute a calculation. Morning had climbed higher while she slept in fragments. Pale light lay across the coverlet and turned the nursery's painted ships into quiet toys again instead of storm shadows. Her neck burned from the angle of the chair. Her wrapped thumb throbbed with each beat of her own blood. She straightened slowly so the room would not tilt. The wool throw slid from one shoulder and pooled in her lap. She stared at it for a breath, remembering only then that she had not covered herself. Ned moved, sighed, and opened his eyes. They were clear. "Catherine," he whispered, voice rough with sleep, "did I fall?" "You did," she said, leaning close so he did not have to strain. "You were very brave about it." He considered this in grave silence, child-serious even in weakness. "Will Uncle scold me?" "Not today." At the far side of the room, near the window where dawn had first broken, Lord Thorne stood as if he had been carved there and left in place. He had removed his coat again. His shirt sleeves were still rolled. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He did not look like a man who had gone to bed and returned. He looked like a man who had measured the same narrow space for hours and refused to trust anyone else with it. Catherine rose out of habit because he was a lord and she was in his house and rank had its reflexes. Pins and needles shot up her calves. Her knees failed for an instant. "Stop!" His voice was low, immediate. "Do not stand quickly." The command reached her before pride did. She caught the chair back and waited until the rush passed. Heat climbed her face at being seen in weakness, then dropped away when she looked at him and found no mockery there, only attention stripped of ornament. He crossed the room in 3 strides and set a hand under her elbow, not gripping, only steadying. His palm was cool. The contact lasted the span of one breath. He stepped away at once, as if proximity itself required discipline. The nurse entered with fresh water and froze on the threshold. Lord Thorne did not turn. "Quietly," he said, "and send Mrs. Davies." The nurse curtsied and obeyed. By the time the clock in the corridor struck 6, Mrs. Davies had arrived with tea, oat porridge, and clean linen. Her knowing eyes taking in the basin rings, the stack of damp cloths, Catherine's collapsed posture, and the child now awake and asking for weak honeyed milk. She set the tray on a side table and moved to Ned with soft efficiency. "Small sips, Master Ned. No arguing today." "I never argue," he said, then glanced at Catherine and amended. "Often." Mrs. Davies's mouth twitched, almost a smile gone at once. A triumph of honesty. Catherine reached for the tray to help and hissed under her breath when the movement pulled at her palm. The linen strip had dried to the broken skin. Lord Thorne heard the small sound. He looked at her hand. "Sit." "My lord, I can serve—" "Sit." The word was iron. She sat. He took the kettle himself and poured tea into a cup that should have been poured by servants for him, and not by him for anyone. Steam rose between them. He set the cup by her knee, then pulled a chair opposite, and, without asking permission, lifted her injured hand into the light. Catherine went still. Instinct told her to pull away. Practical sense told her that movement would tear fresh skin. The linen came loose under his careful fingers. He unwrapped the hand fully and looked at the torn blister, the reddened knuckles, the places where old marks had yellowed to green near her wrist and forearm. He did not flinch. He did not pretend not to see. "Liar," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "You said last night you could hold a pen now." "I could." "You could, and bled through cloth while doing it." The rebuke should have stung. Instead, something inside her, taught for years, shifted by a fraction, because he had named the fact rather than the offence. Lady Marwood called pain insolence. He called it what it was. Mrs. Davies returned with the linen case and paused. Lord Thorne did not release Catherine's hand. "Bandage this properly," he told the housekeeper. "Ointment first, not the cheap salve, the good jar from my cabinet." Mrs. Davies inclined her head. "Yes, my lord." Catherine tried again. "Your lordship, that is unnecessary." His eyes came back to hers, storm grey, sleepless, unyielding. "I decide what is necessary in this house." The sentence could have been tyranny in another man. In him, at that moment, it was shelter spoken in the grammar he knew best. Mrs. Davies worked with gentle precision, cleaning and rewrapping while Ned drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Catherine drank the tea because refusing would have been performance, and she had no strength left for performance. Warmth spread slowly down into the hollow beneath her ribs. She had not realized how violently she had been shaking until the cups stopped rattling against the saucer. Lord Thorne watched until her hand was bound and her cup emptied, then rose. "Come to the library when you can walk without swaying." "I can come now." "You can come in 10 minutes. Eat first." He left before she could answer, and she sat in the wake of that refusal, with her pulse unsteady for reasons that had little to do with fever watches. When she entered the library, the fires had been built higher and a long table had been cleared. On one end lay the damaged Harrington volume, Lady Marwood's order, and 3 ledgers from Ross and Company that she had not brought with her. Her breath caught. She moved to the table and touched the top ledger as if it might disappear. How did these come here? I sent for them at first light. He stood by the mantel, coat on now, cravat retied, every line of him restored to public hardness, except the fatigue around his eyes. Paternoster stall inventory secured in presence of 2 independent witnesses. Written statements signed. "Your cart and unsold stock are in my Easter carriage house under lock." Catherine turned sharply. "On what authority?" "Mine. Lady Marwood will call it theft." "Let her." She stared at him, mind racing ahead through statutes and loopholes, and the 1,000 ways power-bent law before law could bend power back. If she petitions debt seizure, magistrates may grant temporary custody of stock pending review. If she alleges I colluded, then she alleges against me as well. The simplicity of it knocked the next protest from her tongue. He stepped to the table and placed one finger on the order bearing Lady Marwood's signature. "This document threatens seizure by sunset for debt she has not proven. You were to be removed from your own trade floor before independent audit. That is not housekeeping. That is concealment." Catherine swallowed. "You read account law." "I read enough to know when a woman is being stripped in public with ink." The room held very still around them. Fire settled in the grate with a soft fall of coal. She found her voice by force. "You moved quickly, my lord." "I have been watching longer than one night." Her head lifted. He did not soften the statement or retreat from it. "For 12 weeks, he said, "every purchase for Blackthorn passed through intermediaries who inflated prices by near a quarter. I traced the chain backward. It ended at Marwood Clark's and a bookseller's stall where the records were exact, despite damaged stock and underfed staff." He opened the top Ross ledger and turned pages with military precision. "Your hand appears in margin corrections where Pike misadded columns. Your notation for water damage is consistent across months. You mark provenance in abbreviated Latin when space is limited. You do not round figures even when rounding would favor you." His gaze pinned hers. "You were doing an auditor's work while being treated as a porter." No one had ever spoken her labour back to her in full. For a moment she could not breathe around it. He continued, voice lower now. 3 times I saw you on Paternoster before the accident, in rain once, in sleet once, in heat once, always lifting alone, always counted aloud like a suspect. His jaw tightened. I did not intervene then. That error will not be repeated. Catherine felt the words strike deep, not because he claimed to care, but because he named omission as error, not fate. Men of rank did not usually admit error to women with torn gloves. She placed both palms on the table to steady herself, newly bandaged hand resting beside the seal on Lady Marwood's order. "Why me?" His expression shifted by a degree, not enough for most people to read, enough for her. "Because you are competent," he said. "Because you do not panic when blood is on the floor. Because my nephew is alive this morning and would not be if you had waited for rank to grant permission. That is gratitude, not strategy. It is both." The directness of it made her flush. He reached into his inner pocket and set a folded document beside the ledgers. Heavy paper, fresh ink, blackthorn seal. A formal appointment, estate cataloguer with authority to inspect all library acquisitions, invoices and storage chests in my London house and country seat. Salary stated, independent of your board. She scanned the opening lines, pulse quickening. The terms were generous, yes, but more than generosity. Legal standing, access rights in writing, witnessed signature lines prepared below. "If I sign this," she said slowly, "Lady Marwood will understand at once what I intend." "Good! She will retaliate." His face became unreadable stone. "She may try. I cannot hide behind your name forever." "You will not hide." He leaned one hand on the table, close enough that she felt his body heat in the cold room. "You will work. I will ensure you are not touched while you do it." The words were quiet. Absolute. A knock sounded. Thorne's secretary, Mr. Hale, entered with 2 clerk books and stopped when he saw Catherine at the table. His gaze flicked to the appointment paper, to Thorne's hand braced beside it, to Catherine's bandaged wrist. Surprise flashed and vanished under training. "My lord, the solicitor has arrived." "Bring him in, and hear this first." Thorne did not raise his voice. "From this hour, Miss Ross is retained under Blackthorn authority. Any correspondence regarding her debts, person, or trade passes through my office. Any attempt to remove her by force is to be met by house guards and recorded for magistrate review." Mr. Hale inclined his head. "Understood, my lord." He withdrew. There it was, spoken into the machinery of the house where orders became facts by repetition, not private kindness, public alignment, the sort of protection that could not be quietly undone tomorrow without cost. Catherine stared at the appointment page because looking at him felt suddenly dangerous in a way she could not name cleanly. Her skin prickled where his hand had steadied her in the nursery. The body learned truths before the mind agreed to them. She did not trust that lesson. She trusted ink. She picked up the pen. Before the nib touched paper, she asked, "If this fails, if your solicitor finds my evidence insufficient, what then?" "Then we continue until it is sufficient." "No. I asked what happens to me." His answer came without delay. "You remain under my protection." She signed her name in a hand that trembled once, then steadied. Catherine Ross. He took the pen and signed beneath with swift, angular strokes, Alistair Thorne. The solicitor entered as sand was sprinkled over wet signatures. He bowed. Mr. Hale followed with witness ledger open. Mrs. Davies appeared silently with sealing wax. One by one, the acts that made private decisions binding were completed in plain daylight. When the witnesses withdrew, Catherine gathered the ledgers to her side of the table and opened the first to a marked page. Numbers, dates, initials. Terrain she understood. Lord Thorne remained where he was, not dismissing her, not turning away, as if movement itself would break something newly forged between command and trust. Outside, rain began again, soft against the tall glass. Inside, Catherine dipped the pen and drew the first line that would bring Lady Marwood to account, while the man who had refused half London stood within arm's reach and did not move. By the time the second page was complete, Mr. Hale returned with the solicitor and a magistrate's clerk, both damp from the weather and brisk with the impatience of men paid to turn private harm into public fact. The solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, laid out the immediate position without embroidery. Lady Marwood had already sent notice of debt enforcement to 2 ward officers and 1 court messenger. If Catherine remained merely a dependent in Lady Marwood's household books, seizure of her person as an unpaid companion could be requested before noon the next day. If Catherine stood as an independently contracted professional under Blackthorn authority, with separate wages and witness signatures, the petition could be challenged. If Catherine stood as Lady Thorn, Lady Marwood's claim over her residence failed at once. Fenwick looked from one to the other and lowered his voice. "I do not advise marriage as sentiment. I advise it as legal armour. The choice remains yours, Miss Ross." Catherine set her palm on the ledger to steady it. "And if I decline marriage?" "Then we fight on contract and evidence alone," Fenwick said. "We may still win. We will not win quickly." Thorn did not look at the solicitor. He looked only at Catherine. "You will not be pressed." She met his gaze and heard, beneath the command, the same restraint he had used at Ned's bedside. "If this is done," she said, "it is done as partnership. Ross and Company remains mine in operation. My wages remain mine. My testimony remains mine. Agreed. No hidden clauses." "None." Mr. Hale opened his mouth, then shut it, then said with unusual bluntness, "My lord had your terms drafted before dawn." Catherine turned to him. The loaded look he had worn in the library resolved into plain loyalty. He had not been surprised by the paper because he had written half of it. Mrs. Davies was called. Ned, still weak but clear-eyed, was brought to the threshold in a dressing gown and refused to return to bed until he had seen Catherine standing. 3 streets away, under a special licence Fenwick had secured on Thorn's seal, they were married in a narrow chapel that smelled of wet wool and candle wax. No flowers, no music, no audience except those required to make a woman safe in law. The clergyman, 2 witnesses, a clerk with shaking fingers from cold, Mr. Hale with the registry book, Mrs. Davies with Catherine's borrowed mantle clasped at the throat. Thorn signed first in swift, dark strokes. Catherine signed next, hand-bandaged, letters precise despite pain. When the clergyman offered a blessing in a voice gone hoarse with routine, Thorn bowed once and led her back to the carriage before the morning light turned the streets silver. That evening, at a publisher's supper in Holborn, where creditors, printers, and minor nobility traded favours over polished silver, Lady Marwood arrived in rose-scented silk and took her place as if she still owned every room she entered. Catherine stood near the long table with copied ledgers stacked before her and felt 50 eyes assess her plain dark gown, her repaired glove, her right to remain where she stood. Lady Marwood let the silence stretch, then smiled for the room. "You have all been inconvenienced by this girl's instability. She has stolen account books, slandered her family, and attached herself to a grieving household for advantage. I ask your patience while officers return her to proper supervision." A thin laugh moved around the table, eager and careful. Lady Marwood lifted a hand toward Catherine as one might indicate damaged goods. "Poor child, she mistakes arithmetic for rank." Thorn set down his glass. The sound was small. It silenced the room more completely than shouting. "Good," he said. "I married her." No one moved. Mr. Hale stepped forward and placed the signed marriage register on the table beside the decanter, where everyone could see the parish seal, the signatures, the hour. Lady Marwood's colour drained beneath powder and returned in a blotched wave of fury. "This is a forgery!" Fenwick handed the document to the magistrate present at supper by prior arrangement. "Examine the seal, sir, then examine these." He tapped the stack Catherine had prepared. Ross sales books, Blackthorn acquisition ledgers, Pike's drafts, and Lady Marwood's own order commanding seizure by sunset. Catherine did not wait for permission. She opened the first ledger and read line by line the sequence of false transfers. Date, title, claimed seller, actual shelf mark, inflated price, missing receipt. She laid the damaged Harrington First Edition on the linen cloth and turned to the fly-leaf where Ross ink and Thorn crest sat on the same page like two witnesses refusing to look away. She produced her waxed notebook from her bodice and matched each pocket entry to the formal line Mr. Pike had altered. The magistrate listened with the tired face of a man expecting domestic grievance and finding commercial fraud instead. Lady Marwood laughed once, brittle as breaking glass. "You will trust a sharp girl over a lady." Catherine lifted another paper. "You may trust your own steward's hand, then." She placed Pike's draft beside the fair copy and pointed to the transposed shilling column, the scraped ink, the overwritten total. "And this order, signed by Lady Marwood, demanding private transfer of locked folios she had no title to sell." Across the table, one of the ward officers cleared his throat. "My lady, did you authorise seizure before audit?" "I authorised protection of household assets." "Assets not in your name," Fenwick said. By the second week of November, London had turned hard with cold, and every breath in the hearing chamber smoked pale in the air. The formal hearing took place in a cramped court near Guildhall, benches crowded with stationers, apprentices, and two coachmen who had seen Catherine hauled through rain for months, and now stood at the back in their work coats. Doctor Ellery appeared briefly, summoned to confirm Ned's injury timeline, and Catherine's presence at Blackthorn House through the night in question. His earlier written note, stained from handling, was entered into record to close any claim that she had stolen the ledgers during those hours. The parish surveyor gave dry testimony that the loose cobble on Paternoster Row had been logged for repair 3 days earlier, settling the muttered rumour of staged accident before it could become convenient fiction. Then came the last document. Catherine drew from her reticule the folded scrap she had guarded for years, her father's old seal impression in dull red wax. She set it beside the transfer instrument Lady Marwood claimed proved debt ownership. The court clerk leaned close. Even in worn wax, the Ross lion's tail curved left. On the alleged transfer, it curved right, mirrored from a copying press, and pressed with a newer die. Lady Marwood stood very straight as the magistrate asked her once to explain. She said nothing. He asked again, this time naming embezzlement, forgery, and fraudulent coercion. Her hands shook, not with sorrow, with calculation failing in public. "I did what was required," she said at last, voice thin and angry. "The shop was failing. The girl was unmanageable. Her father would have ruined us all." Catherine didn't flinch. "My father taught me to keep true books." The magistrate nodded to the constables. "Record the admission." Lady Marwood turned toward Catherine with raw hatred stripped of perfume. "No lord keeps a bookseller's daughter once novelty fades." Thorn answered, before Catherine needed to. "You mistake me for your kind." Constables stepped forward. Silk rustled like dry leaves as they escorted Lady Marwood down the aisle she had once used like a stage, past clerks who no longer lowered their eyes. Helena and Ivy did not attend. Mr. Pike, called and sworn, admitted under pressure that Mr. Hale's hard stare made impossible to evade that he had altered entries at Lady Marwood's instruction. The inventory chest keys were surrendered in court and logged. The recovered Harrington volume was returned to Blackthorn custody by written receipt. Ross ledgers were copied, sealed, and entered. Every item that had been hidden in shadow moved into daylight, named and placed. 3 days later, under a clean winter sky, Catherine stood before the repainted sign on Paternoster Row and watched the new lettering dry. Ross & Co., Catherine Ross, proprietor. Thorne had offered marble counters and gilt trim. She had refused both and kept the old oak, scarred and honest. Inside, shelves were reset by subject and condition in her father's system. A second desk stood near the back for Blackthorn cataloguing work, as agreed. Mrs. Davies sent hot tea at noon. Mr. Hale delivered contracts each Friday with witness copies already tied. Ned, pale but recovering, sat on a stool by the travel section and announced to any customer who paused that Miss Ross had stronger hands than most surgeons, and that his uncle listened when she spoke, which, he added gravely, was rare and useful. Catherine tried to hush him. Thorne, standing by the doorway in a dark coat, with reins still on his shoulders, said only, "He is accurate." Trade came first in cautious trickles, then in steadier flow, as word spread that the accounts were clean, prices fair, provenance exact. The curate, who had once replaced a stained tract, paid in full and bowed to Catherine by name. The stationer's clerk next door stopped smirking and lowered his prices by honest competition instead of theft. No one counted volumes over her shoulder. At dusk, when the shutters were barred and the till balanced, Catherine carried the daybook to the back desk where Thorne waited with Blackthorn's latest acquisition list. She set the figures down between them. "Balanced to the farthing," she said. He scanned the page, then looked up. "As expected." There was warmth in the room from the small stove, from tea gone half cold, from work completed and entered cleanly in ink. Outside, carts rattled through the dark. Inside, no one shouted her name like a charge sheet. No one asked gratitude as payment for harm. Thorne touched the edge of the ledger, but not her hand. "Tomorrow we review the country inventory." "Tomorrow," she said. He gave one short nod, the shape of a promise in his own language, and remained beside her as she sanded the final line, closed the book, and pressed the Ross seal into wax that belonged to her again.